Good morning. Thank you for coming this morning to the first plenary of ICPP6. My name is Carolyn Johns. I'm a professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration here at Toronto Metropolitan University. And I'm also the chair of the Bruce Fellowships in Canadian Freshwater Policy. Welcome to Toronto. Also known as Takaranto, the place in the water where trees are standing on Lake Ontario in the majestic Great Lakes region. I, like Joselle in the first session, would like to take a few moments to do a land acknowledgement. As a colonial settler myself, who does research in the Great Lakes Basin, this is a region of great history and deep meaning to Indigenous peoples. And as Joselle mentioned this morning, Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. And as Joselle mentioned, we all individually are reflecting on our own personal journeys through truth and reconciliation. And our university, TMU, has been on this journey in the last several years. So I'm going to just provide a little bit of foundation before we jump into our first plenary. When we were putting this panel together, we wanted to select a topic that had broad implications and interdisciplinary appeal, and also a theme of a panel that all of us are thinking about, no matter which area of public policy we are engaged in. It's clear that existential threats are present and evident across the globe, wherever we are, compounded by human population growth, of course, climate change, and the relentless human pursuit of economic growth. The topic of the plenary today has implications for all policy areas, not just environmental policy. Those of you that are interested in health policy, social policy, food, agriculture, energy, migration are all connected to the theme of today's topic. We know that there are complex and uncertain governance challenges that challenge us beyond collective action at the global scale, beyond national capacity to address, and at the state and community scale. In policy speak, incrementalism and the status quo policies are not sufficient, and our awareness of that is evident all around us. I'd like to draw your attention to an artist who actually is a graduate of TMU. You may know Edward Bertinsky. He's a renowned photographer and documentary filmmaker who documents the human impacts on the earth at scales typically that we can't experience. We're seeing heat waves and floods, and we experience wildfires. But Ed's work documents the human impacts on the planet at a massive scale. His work over the past 40 years and his most recent work, called In the Wake of Progress, is a testament to the scale of our collective impact on the environment and the planet. His prior work, also on the Anthropocene and water, provide documentary and drone video evidence of the scale of this unprecedented human impacts, particularly focused on the extractive economy. His work, although not kind of policy driven, really highlights the failure of our collective action to deal with some of these policy challenges at the global and national scales. Oops. So the panel title today is Transformative Policy Futures in the Age of Anthropocene. And we have a distinguished panel, and we framed the panel around 3 questions. Are transformative policy futures possible? What knowledge and governance shifts are evident and required for taking necessary transformative policy changes in the age of Anthropocene? What new knowledge and approaches are required for thinking creatively and engaging in research about transformative policy futures? So we have 4 panelists today. They're going to offer some insights and answers to those provocative questions. We have 2 panelists joining us online and 2 in person. So I'm going to do an introduction of each of the panelists, and then we will turn the panel over and have our speakers followed by a question and answer period, both in the room, and we are going to take some online questions as well. So the first speaker is Frank Bierman, who is Professor of Global Sustainability and Governance at the Institute of Sustainable Development at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. Frank is a leading international scholar on Earth governance systems, the limitations of geoengineering, and climate engineering. He's published on policy and governance challenges related to the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, the decline of sustainability symmetry in the Stockholm +50 context, and also published several articles about alternative environmental policy approaches. He has published 18 books and over 200 articles and is founder of the Earth Systems Governance Project and editor of the Earth Systems Governance Journal. He argues that Earth system governance is an empirical reality and also a political necessity. Our second panelist is Deborah McGregor, here with us today. Deborah is professor and a Canadian research chair in Indigenous environmental justice at Osgoode Hall Law School at York University here in Canada. Deborah is an Anishinaabe from Whitefish River First Nation, Birch Island, Ontario. She is a member of York's Osgoode Hall Law faculty and cross-appointed with the Faculty of Environmental Studies and Urban Change. Her research focuses on Indigenous knowledge systems, their various applications in diverse contexts, including water, environmental justice, forest policy, sustainable development, and climate change. Her research has been published broadly in interdisciplinary, Indigenous studies, environmental policy journals, and a range of government advisory reports. Our third speaker is Jola Ajibade, who is an associate professor of environmental sciences at Emory University. She is a scholar and activist who applies both environmental justice and political ecology lenses to study the intersections of climate risk, urban disasters, resilience planning, coastal management, and urban transformations. She examines how climate adaptation solutions, such as managed floating cities, tree planting, blue-green infrastructure, and utopian development projects intersect with public policy and structural and historical injustices that perpetuate race, gender, and class-based inequalities. Her research advances ideas specifically focused on a just urban transition. And Brian Head is our final speaker. Brian is from the School of Political Science and International Studies, the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Queensland in Australia. Brian has a scholarly and practitioner background and has published books such as Wicked Public Policy Problems and does research at the interface of policy and practice. So if you can take a minute, give applause to our panelists, and we will start it with Frank Bierman. Welcome, Frank.
Can you see the slides? Are the slides visible? Yep.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. I mean, it looks like a fantastic conference. I just heard the introduction with 1,300 participants from 80 countries, all these grants. The growth of your association, I mean, congratulations. I mean, it's really a fantastic event. I would have liked to be there in person, but unfortunately I caught the flu, so I was not able to travel. And therefore I have to speak here at Zoom. And I'm very grateful also for the possibility that this was granted and this was possible. I think it's fantastic to start this conference on public policy on this issue of transformative policy futures in the age of the Anthropocene, because I passionately believe that this is one of the most important issues that we need to address in our public policy, in our political science programs in the future. I try to click on my slides. Yeah, the Anthropocene is just to bring it together in one quote that I like to quote. Is actually from 2001 already, from the International Biosphere Program. Is essentially that the Earth system has moved now well outside the range of its natural variability. And Caroline has kind of explained it already. Human activities could now change the entire planetary system to maybe alternative modes of operation that may prove irreversible and less hospitable to humans. Again, this is a statement from the natural sciences, from the largest natural science programs. Again, this is a quote from 2001. It's 22 years old. And that means also that not much has changed. And I think this is one of the fundamental challenges for political science and for public administration, that these kind of tremendous changes that we are observing have not been reflected so far in the field of public policy and political science. I believe they require a new type of governance that is dealing much more effectively with these huge challenges. I believe they require also a new type of a planetary just vision for human cooperation on the entire planet. This is what we describe as Earth system governance. It also requires in public policy, I believe, a new way of deep time thinking that links the past of hundreds of years that have caused many of the problems that we are facing today, but also links it with a future of hundreds of years ahead that is being shaped by decisions that we are taking today. And these are new challenges for political science and new challenges for public administration and for public policy that are not, I believe, sufficiently reflected in the way how our communities functions. And I think also that we need to develop a new type of political critique that is reflecting the changes that are observed in the natural system and the Earth system, and that are not reflected yet in the policies that are developing. So therefore, the question that has been raised by Caroline and the organizers is whether transformative policy futures are possible. And my answer is, of course, yes, of course they are possible. I mean, if I would believe that they are not possible, I would just go to the beach and have a beer and chill out. No, I believe that we can change. I believe that we can change our governance systems. I believe that we can change our political systems to the better. But on the other hand, the challenge is huge, and it's also huge for those who are here at this conference and trying to grapple with the challenges. The urgency is high, especially the climate system's out of control in many ways. And therefore, we need to have a new type of discourse on transformative changes in science, in politics, in governance, and also in academia. And here I want to use the privilege of being the first speaker today and this morning in Toronto and talk a bit about 6 different propositions I would like to make about changes in academia and changes also in public policy and changes maybe also in the way how we organize international research programs such as the ICPP6. So I have 6 propositions that I want to make, starting with the first, which is maybe the least recent one, is that we have to work much more across the campus. We have to work together with natural sciences in challenge-oriented research programs. And that means breaking up the ivory towers, as I see many of the professional associations, and working together with all disciplines in challenge-oriented research programs on climate, on water and biodiversity, on urban transitions, as has been mentioned, and many others. But there are also many problems in these kind of collaborations, especially with natural sciences. There is a tendency, a trend to an unjustified quantification, because in natural sciences programs, anything that doesn't have a number is difficult to integrate. So there's a trend to quantify. There's a trend to a false reductionism in many of these integrated research programs. And there's also a danger of technocraticism. So if you look at this model that I have on my slide there, which is described as a planetary machinery, an attempt by modelers to see the entire Earth system as an integrated model, these kind of ideas are important to understand the Earth system, but they're also dangerous, because understanding the Earth system as a machinery might also call for an engineer. They might call for engineering approaches, and they might, Caroline has mentioned, also lead to a geoengineering approach where you just need to have an engineer, a false technological solution to deal with these kind of challenges. So I would encourage participants to work together across the campus, but also try to understand better how we can really work together in a way that prevents quantification, reductionism, and technocratism. Secondly, we have to work together much more with stakeholders. We have to get out of this world of purely academic collaboration and academic projects, and have to work with other sources of knowledge, with stakeholders in a variety of ways. And this is what many of you are doing. This is many of the existing research programs go into this direction, but I feel that much more is needed into this direction. And I feel also that professional associations as IPPA have a much stronger role to play to integrate stakeholders in their research programs in all phases, starting with the creation, but also the implementation of research programs. But also here, keeping in mind the dangers of these kind of the problems that are inherent. Number one, and I have lots of experiences, as many of you will have, in working with the private sector, being in transdisciplinary research environments, with philanthropic foundations, with the private sector, that easily lead also to a policy capture where critical perspectives, where radical critique is no longer possible, because the private sector as a finance agent in these programs is becoming very dominant. On the other hand, the danger is also the misuse of power relationships by social scientists in these research programs, by designing research programs, deciding who the stakeholders are, deciding who the research design is being developed in some ways. So there are also downsides of these kind of transdisciplinary research programs, but I would very much encourage also the IPPA to be more engaged and these kind of collaborations with stakeholders in the panels, in the way how the organizers or the conferences are being organized, and how research programs are being conducted. My third point is that I believe that in the social sciences in general, probably also in public policy research, we need to have a much stronger normative debate on questions of planetary or environmental justice. I'm very happy that on this particular panel here, which is the opening panel, that we have a strong focus on justice. I think that it's a great development. It's a fantastic decision of the organizers to bring justice up front in this panel. But I believe that in general, much more debate and much more opening to a normative critique and normative ideas is very important for the social sciences in general. Looking at the left graph, for example, shows the percentage of CO2 emissions by the world population, showing that it's only 10% of the global population that is actually responsible for the climate problem. The climate problem is not a problem of humankind. It is a problem of humankind, but not in the causation. The causation is the challenge for the richest 10% of the global population. And this is where the urgency is to take drastic action. And this is a type of debate that is sometimes hidden and that needs to be much stronger, I would argue, also in public policy debates. And a fourth point is related to that. And this is based also at research that we are conducting at Utrecht in the Decolonizing Sustainability Study Group, but also my own experiences in publishing journals and books and organizing conferences, that we have to work much harder and maybe find new and creative ways to organize a globally inclusive discourse. I mean, I heard that there were 80 countries represented here. This is fantastic. Here's some of the research that we are doing in our projects on decolonizing sustainability. For example, these are just some examples. We looked at the citations to the Global Sustainability Development Report, which is from the United Nations. It's a United Nations report which brings together the science on sustainable development. And we counted all the citations to the country that has produced the science, where the scientists were based. And we found, not surprising actually, that 87% of those papers that were cited in this United Nations report were actually produced in OECD countries. Only 1% was produced in the least developed country. The same is also if you look at science networks. We analyzed a number of major global research networks in the field of sustainability. And again, the participation is 80 to 90% from the global north. These are not inclusive. These are not global conversations we are having in the major science networks in the field of sustainability, at least. Or if you look at scientific steering committees, again, 74% in general of those scientific steering committees, executive committees that we are studied were from the global north. So there's a huge demand, a huge need to change the way how global science is organized. And it's of course not necessarily in the hands of those who are organizing these conferences or journals or book series, but I believe that much more is needed, much more is possible also in finding creative solutions to dealing with the injustices and how global science is organized today. And we have to work towards a more globally inclusive discourse on sustainability, but also on many other issues. Coming to my first point, and that is, I believe, from my own understanding, from my own reading, but of course not representing everything that is being done, that we have to become much more radical in our critique. Going back to the citation I had in the beginning, that was from 2001, the definition in a sense of what the Anthropocene is, and not much has changed actually in our political systems. So I believe we have to engage in a more radical critique and a more radical way of how we are discussing public policy, and maybe also a more outgoing activist approach to how public policy is being researched and is being published and is being presented also in the public discourse. For example, we have to accept what doesn't work. This is my own research field over the last couple of years. It was mentioned. I spent a lot of time with my team on studying the Sustainable Development Goals. This new idea from the United Nations launched in 2015 to have 17 broad goals, sustainable development goals, from no hunger down to climate change and better life on land and protecting peace and justice, etc. So any kind of human activity was essentially covered in these 17 goals. They had 169 targets. And that was in 2015, when these goals were published. They were presented as a transformation. The United Nations and all the governments presented them as the step, the goals to transform the planet and to really address now the problems of the Anthropocene and of injustice and unsustainability. And we started this very carefully. We looked at a variety of approaches at the impact of these goals at the global, at the local, and at the national level, and we couldn't find much. I mean, we couldn't find much. The projects only coming to an end, and there was not much that we could find. So these kind of approaches do not work. And so my own research is now very much about what could work. So I just give you one example of a question I'm grappling with, is what to do, for example, with short-haul flight movements. And this is a photo taken from my roof, actually, of an airplane flying from KLM to Schiphol. Very annoying, actually. So my question is, in a sense, what can we do to reduce, massively reduce the air transportation that we have in Europe and other places? And we looked at market mechanisms. They just take too long and are too ineffective. Technical solutions are being advanced. They cannot be scaled up. Voluntary standards, we are in a case of urgency. We need to have quick solutions. to really address the climate problem. So therefore, I would argue that we just have to ban short-haul flights. And this is a new paper that we are developing, have been presented at conferences. It's about a network of regional bans on short-haul flights, which sounds maybe radical in the European context, certainly also in other places, but it's also certainly not the main solution. I mean, it's just a small part of the global solution, but we have to try to have a ratcheting up process in public policy to have more radical and more transformative policy ideas in the way forward. And that leads me to my last point, and that is that I believe that in the social sciences, especially in the OECD countries, we have to engage in more scholar activism, as it is sometimes being called. I mean, this left painting I like very much. I mean, this shows to me, in my interpretation, how science and social science has functioned for many years, like reading books. I mean, that's what many people have thought. I mean, like writing books, working together in academic settings, advancing theories, but not really trying to become an agent of change. And I think this is over. We have this tremendous urgency of the Anthropocene, the tremendous urgency to transform our societies and transform our economic systems. And that means also that scientists and social scientists and public policy scholars should really get much more active in the science rebellion and many other social movements that try to bring forward the critique and the concerns of the scientific community that it is not going right the way how the climate system, biodiversity, hunger, and many other problems on our planet are playing. And it just give an example from a personal side, what I have been doing for the last 1.5 years in this space, which is it's this kind of scholar activism, which means that it's an activity that is science-based, but it's not reading to papers, it's not reading to articles, I'm not writing books about it. It's about fighting, as Caroline mentioned, geoengineering. The problem is, I mean, as I understand it, that there are quite a few academic groups these days that are proposing to spray aerosols in the stratosphere by airplanes for hundreds of years to artificially cool the planet as a solution to the climate problem. That is called solar geoengineering. And my own position is this is a very silly idea, it's a very bad idea, it's a very dangerous idea, don't do it. So this is kind of the analytical part. But what we have done with many others together, setting up a network, calling for developing one public policy proposal, which is to call for international non-use agreement on solar engineering, which is based on many other international non-use agreements on biological weapons, on chemical weapons, on Arctic mining, partially also on deep seabed mining, on human cloning, on many other areas where governments have agreed not to engage in the development of a new technology. I think the time is right to exactly agree on that, not to develop technologies for solar geoengineering. And that led to what I describe as scholar activism in a way. So we have set up an open letter with 450 signatories so far. A lot of time goes into social media outreach, setting up a blog. A lot of time goes in fundraising, trying to get support for that, working together with civil societies, working together with United Nations, trying to get support from governments, which takes a lot of time actually. But I believe it's very important. It's certainly more important from my perspective than writing another academic paper. So I really invest a lot of time as opposed to my traditional academic work on these kind of activities, driving forward, in this particular case, an initiative against solar geoengineering. So I'm coming to a close, the time is over. In a sense, my talk comes down to 6 questions maybe for this conference. And unfortunately, I cannot participate, so I can't be there for the reception or for the coffee breaks. But what I find important is, or questions I'm struggling with, and questions I also don't necessarily have an answer to, is how can we work across disciplines without giving in to these dangers of quantification, reductionism, and technocratism that I mentioned? How can we develop a transdisciplinary research agenda without falling into these various traps? And how can we make it meaningful? And also the question for IPPA, maybe for your colleagues in the coffee breaks and in the reception and in other meetings, could be also how transdisciplinary is the IPPA? Is it enough? Is it too transdisciplinary? Maybe to some extent, it's difficult for me to judge, but is this an area which needs to be further developed in the association and the conferences and how they are being organized? How can we bring better questions of justice in? I probably will read more about that from the other speakers. How can we really make our international research agendas and international research programs more inclusive? And also, what role can IPPA play? And I have the same discussions in international research networks in which I'm participating, where we struggle a lot. I have lots of discussions and trying to find creative solutions forward and how we can increase the inclusivity of our global conversations. How can public policy scholars become more radical? Should they? Should we kind of go back actually and just say that we are not doing politics, but we are just doing the theoretical and analytical work, and the politics is done by the policymakers? So where actually are the boundaries, and are maybe different colleagues feeling differently about these issues of where scholars of public policy actually define themselves, where universities define themselves in this urgency of the major catastrophe that the Anthropocene is about to bring. And finally, also for the IPPA, maybe taking again the privilege as being the first speaker who's not even there, how can the IPPA itself become an agent of transformative change in calling for better and for more just, and maybe also for more radical policies in the various countries where colleagues are based, and internationally as well? And should this be actually a solution? So these are some questions that came up when I got this invitation, and I'm looking forward to the discussion, and would really like to hear also what other colleagues of the 1,300 participants think about this issue. Thank you so much for the invitation, and again, apologies that I cannot be here in person with you in Toronto this morning. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Frank. And I've called Deborah McGregor to the podium.
Can you hear me? I just have to move this a little bit. Yeah. Good morning, everyone. And I guess it's up to the rest of us to answer those questions. So big questions. So I do have a PowerPoint. There is text, but I'm not going to read it. I expect you to be able to read it faster than I would ever read it. I'll just comment around it. So happy to be here. Been involved in various policy climate circles in the Canadian context for some time. So hopefully just we'll be able to shed you some insights from my perspective. As Carolyn pointed out, I am Anishinaabe. I get to work and live in my own territory as a Great Lakes Anishinaabe person. So the questions that are posed for this panel, they're huge. And fortunately, you have a range of panelists and we'll offer you different perspectives. Oh, good, it's up there. All right. So to the first question, are transformative policy futures possible? And I would say I agree with the first panelist, Frank, and just say we don't actually really have a choice in the matter. Like if we don't, you know, things are not going to look so good for human. They already don't look good for humanity, but it's going to get worse. I chose to show this image. This is already 2010, so almost 15 years ago. But what it offered was this different vision, how we might be able to relate to the earth in more sustainable kind of ways. This call for cooperation among humans that we heard in the first presentation, I would say this cooperation also has to happen with the natural world. So already these ideas for how we need to transform and shift our thinking, our worldview and paradigms already exists. And I think this was one of them. So I just wanted to share, yeah, people have been thinking about this and there are different ideas and transformative ideas and ways of relating to the earth that already exists. So there needs to be essentially a complete overhaul. Oops, got a little too quick there. So many of us who've been paying attention, which should be all of us, because pretty well, you know, if you were living in Canada, you were breathing in climate change, wildfire smoke, probably tomorrow you will be as well. They're calling for that. So there's no way that this is one of those problems that's way over there. That's what Inuit people deal with in the north. This is like everybody's issue at the moment. So, so there's the plant, I call it like the disaster reports that come out pretty well every year, the IPBS, the World Water Reports, the IPCC reports, not looking good. And we already hit that point. We've already hit that, you know, we're on the downslide of that slope of diminishing returns. So again, we don't have a choice. But what's interesting about all these reports that I've always, is there a bit of an echo or is that just me? Maybe I need to move it further away. Does that sound better than kind of echoey? All right, we'll do that. Is they all call for transformation. They're all calling for like massive societal transformation at every level and every sector of society. It's just that there's been, in my view, a real lack of imagination about what that should look like, or at least a buy-in for that kind of imagination for what that can look like. What you see is a tweaking of the status quo, maybe a tweaking of the business as usual, but the broader trajectory hasn't changed at all. And that's what needs to change. So this message of transformation has been there for some time, every time a disaster report comes out. So you can look for those every time one comes out. All right, the Earth's guidance. So from the work that I do primarily with First Nations in Ontario and in Canada through my work with the Assembly of First Nations, is that the IPCC reports reveal that humans are the cause of this climate change that we're dealing with, but that even took a long time to convince people of that. Like it seemed like that was obvious. When I look back at the Indigenous international declarations, they've been saying that for like decades and decades and decades. So it's not news on our front. But in our worldview, if humans aren't clever enough to figure this out, then we turn to the natural world. That's what a lot of our stories point to. I don't have time to get into stories that I draw on in the work that I do that say, you know, we need to look sometimes elsewhere for inspiration and imagination and solutions. I think internationally and in Canada, they weirdly call that nature-based solutions. I mean, I think about it differently, but that's kind of weirdly part of that idea. But that's another story. Okay, so what shifts are needed? As I pointed out, like the roots of that, the seeds of that already exist. We don't have to like make stuff up. It already kind of exists. What we need to do is make it happen. As was pointed out, we have to be more than, you know, maybe scholars who think all the time, which is good, but to act on our knowledge. So, so what shifts are needed? And here I'm going to comment more on sort of my involvement and sort of climate change circles in the Canadian context, policy context is part of that transformation from an Indigenous perspective, and I think others will comment as well from that planetary health or environmental or climate justice perspective, is you have to deal with colonialism. So from our perspective, and there was a great article written by Zoe Todd and another author that the Anthropocene happened for us when colonization happened. So that's where we can trace it back to. So for us, if public policy doesn't deal with colonialism and the impacts and the vulnerabilities that it creates in Indigenous peoples in Canada, it's going to perpetuate it. Your solutions, or the solutions, and I've seen this, are actually going to perpetuate further injustice. So it has to account for that. And they're not very good at that as far as I can tell. And if you're really interested, you can go to the Indigenous Climate Action website and find their report that looks at Canadian climate change policy and how it's not very decolonizing at all. And often you find it hard to, you don't really see that word in there. I call it like the other C word that people don't like there's climate, there's carbon, and then there's colonization. And people can't quite figure out what to do with that in the climate change context. So the climate crisis, so I find that a lot of the public policy, particularly internationally, doesn't really think about Indigenous peoples as being societies. We're like stakeholders or interest groups. But meanwhile, we have rights. It's the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. There's also human rights considerations, how women and other vulnerable people are considered in all of this. You're always on the outside looking in. So what ends up happening, and this is Ariel Deranger, who's the actually executive director for Indigenous Climate Action, they spend a lot of their time doing advocacy. So all their energy is putting into advocacy, which is great. And it would be great if they had, more scholars support, but you're not getting to be the decision maker. If you can see the difference when you're putting your energy into, can we at least show up and have a voice? Then that's where you're putting your energy into, as opposed to being part of actual decision making and policy making. So it's that's the scenario that a lot of Indigenous peoples and likely others find themselves in. So there definitely needs to be a shift in who's going to be part of these discussions, whose voice counts, what kind of knowledge is going to be part of formulating, public policy that's going to make sense. She also points out that public policy has to deal with capitalism in a different way than it currently does. So there's all these other aspects of public policy that has to be dealt with. So you can't say we're going to deal with climate change and then all kinds of pipelines and other things are approved in Canada. So there's always these contradictions and tensions that exist. I will try to stay on time. So in the Canadian context, they do speak about in the climate, what we would call the climate policies, Indigenous climate leadership is pointed out. Because again, Indigenous peoples, often what's happening to us is people ask us to be part of these other people's solutions and strategies and plans and, input our knowledge, maybe our experience, but we never really get to do our own thing. We never really get to kind of direct what climate change future might look like for us. That's generally not supported. We're always sort of supposed to input into other people's. Again, that points to a lack of recognition as Indigenous peoples as societies and governments. Maybe we want to govern this ourselves, develop our own policy. So even though it's sort of there in theory, how it's been realized that hasn't happened yet. Although I think there's little, I'm on the AFN's Climate and Environment Advisory Committee, and there's overtures to that, but it's very challenging to try to change that system and sort of, again, that paradigm shift between people should govern, people should be decision makers, as opposed to, again, on the outside looking in and always, having to act in that way. So I just, again, wanted to just point out, I regard, because I'm Anishinaabe, I can't speak on behalf of all Indigenous people on the planet or even in this territory, so I go to the International Indigenous Environmental Climate Change Declarations and see all these people, hundreds of nations from all over the world come together. And they were already kind of doing their own climate assessment. That's how I look at it. Their own experiences, their own knowledge becomes part of what they're laying out in a lot of these declarations. And this is just one of them from the Beijing Declaration of Indigenous Women in '95. I won't read it for you. You can always Google these and you can read the whole declaration if you're interested. Again, advocating for a human rights approach, a more holistic, gender sensitive sort of approach, which a lot of these policies don't do at all. They don't really account for gender in them very well. Again, nothing about us without us. That can apply to just about anything, I think, and anyone. I don't know how much time I have. I'm trying to stick to my time period, but I'm really looking forward to fielding questions from you as well and hearing from my other panelists. So I call this ancient new knowledge, because again, like that paradigm shift, those seeds of transformation, they already exist. They just haven't been scaled up or respected in many different what I call circles. But a lot of this, again, responds to the question of what new knowledge is needed. And my view is, well, that knowledge already exists. It just hasn't been, because I'm an academic, I'll use this horrible word, mobilized into these realms, into these decision-making realms. Again, you're on the outside looking in, you're on the outside looking in. Maybe you're a part of these other, but maybe I've been in part of different strategies where I'm like the only Indigenous person, and maybe after meetings and meeting, I get a bullet, right? Or get put in a little box that says Indigenous perspective. So you're not really, part of, you don't really feel like you're part of this big decision-making, but this knowledge is already there. And it hasn't really been, or if it is shared, people don't quite know what to do with it. It's like, okay, that's nice, but we don't know how to fit this into the way that we currently do policy and decision-making. Again, Canada trying to go there with the Client Science 250 report. Again, really aspirational, but the implementation side of it, even after 3 years, I haven't really seen. And as these things go, this could all quite dramatically change depending on what happens in the next federal election, right? So that'll hugely impact what programs could be funded. Like, so all of this is also very vulnerable to politics, even though there's this strategy, which I'm very excited about, because it really calls for Indigenous research leadership that the previous presenter spoke to. Like, what kind of innovative kind of research that we need to do with people to really insert some innovation and imagination and creativity into what we're constructing as being solutions. It also speaks to how Indigenous knowledge and Western sciences, I don't like that all the time because it's a binary. There's all kinds of other knowledges that should also be part of these conversations as well. So again, very aspirational, and then I should step back a little bit into these processes. So that's part of what I'm trying to do, is figure that out. What does that look like in my work? So in my view, Indigenous peoples already have climate knowledge. So since our Anthropocene, which started with colonization, we've had to face dramatic environmental and climatic change. Like, we've learned a lot from doing that, because here we are despite genocidal policies. So we already have knowledge about how to do that. We already have climate knowledge, but again, how does it be respected? Because that's a big issue, and be mobilized into these spaces to influence leadership, decision-making, policy. Because policy, often it'll say, we should really consider Indigenous knowledge of Western science, but like, you know, the people who are charged with doing that really don't know how. So it's land-based. It also includes our legal and governance traditions. So it's not just knowledge. People like to extract our knowledge, or they try to. It's a very extractive paradigm, without considering the whole system that we're part of, the society that we're part of. Some ideas, these are just some ideas about how I think decolonizing governance, policy, and laws might look like, at least in the Canadian context. I think it has currency globally and internationally in other spaces. The importance of land and land-based activities. So people don't think about language revitalization on the land activities as actually being climate action in a First Nation, but it is. Because what they know is 80% of the biodiversity is on 20% of the lands that Indigenous peoples manage or caretake. And that's also where Indigenous languages are spoken. So we would see that as climate action. That's part of our climate solution. That's what needs to be supported in Indigenous communities, so that people can then draw on that knowledge. Again, I won't read this, because this is a lot of the advocacy that I find myself in a position of doing, is how can we decolonize a lot of these policies that need to happen at every level, or even involvement in policy development, which also needs to happen. So engage Indigenous people at all scales and level, recognizing that it's a society. It's not just people that you want to go extract knowledge from and participants in a study, but actual peoples, part of societies and communities. Indigenous knowledge is not just data collection. So again, that's a whole other story about how Indigenous knowledge is dealt with in the field, not to compartmentalize. So this was spoken about in the previous panel. What I find in my work is there's already compartments for how to think about climate change. There's mitigation, monitoring, adaptation, and like I've been told, that's mitigation. We're talking about adaptation. They don't vulnerability and to risk, but really the way that we all experience this, we don't experience it in silos. Indigenous people don't, and neither do all of, like none of us do. We experience it as humans and in holistic and kind of multiple ways, but the field doesn't recognize that for how it's studied. So we do need different ways of how we're going to try to understand what's going on and seek solutions at every level. And this requires, of course, recovery of traditional systems. So again, support to Indigenous societies to be Indigenous in who they want to be. That's actually part of, in my view, climate solutions. So those are my thoughts to share with you today. Hopefully that's enough for you to go on and have conversations about later. And thank you, Frank, for your presentation. I look forward to hearing my colleagues. So Chimigwech for your time.
Okay, Jola, are you there?
Yes, I am. I'm gonna try to share my screen. Okay, just a second.
Great.
Let's try this again. Just okay, and then where's the screen share Zoom? Okay. I don't know. Can people see my screen?
Yes, we
Okay.
can.
And so not sure what folks are saying. Okay, is this good? Yeah, let me get started. I want to thank the organizers of this event.
Sorry,
for-
Jola, could you just hit swap displays? We're seeing your,
Okay.
yeah.
So let's try that again. Okay, swap display. Should have tried this earlier. So multiple screen. Let me know if this is the right one. Is
That's
that
the
one?
right one. Thank you.
Perfect. Glad we got this sorted.
Great.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you everyone for being here. I want to thank the organizers of the event. And I want to thank you, audience, being there. I really wanted to be there in person, quite honestly, but I spent hours at the airport yesterday because there was this major severe weather condition from New York, so I couldn't fly. So that's why I'm presenting from the hotel here in New York. And I also want to thank, the presenters before me, Frank and Deborah. I think they did lay a very good foundation for some of the things that I want to address in my own talk and in response to the questions that we've been asked to think about. So the image before you here, you can see, that image of, air pollution and the plastics and the ocean destruction and land destructions. All of those things in my mind, as I think through a lot of the changes that we've had, we've seen a lot of the transformation of the commons, both for good and for bad. And so I want to focus on social and ecological justice issues in transformations of the commons in the Anthropocene, but also the kinds of policy shift that we need to move things in the right direction. So that's what I'll be talking about today. And to address those issues, I just want to remind us that as Caroline mentioned earlier, we face a whole lot of issues. So it's not just climate change. Obviously, climate change is a big one, but we're experiencing massive, biodiversity loss. I had a presentation with some students in Brazil just about 2 weeks ago, and I shared this particular list with them in no particular order because we're dealing with everything together. And they said, food insecurity is the biggest issue for them. Like, it's not just about climate change, and I agree. So for different societies, the problems in the Anthropocene, they are compounded and they are multiple, and there are people going through wars and conflicts, water insecurity, air pollution, all of these issues. But as we face these issues, we also must remember the legacies that have brought us here, right? Which was what Deborah was talking about earlier, the legacies of colonialism, land and labor extraction, unbridled neoliberalism, racial capitalism, to be quite honest, global inequality and power imbalances between countries and within countries. All of these things persist. And for groups that have been historically marginalized, these are not just one-off issues. These are intersectional issues, right? So when we think about the unique circumstances of power and privileges and the identities of people, for some people, all of these issues are experienced in very severe ways, in addition to issues of ableism, of racism, of discrimination, of gender inequality. And so the intersections of this problem, I think we also need to keep in mind that as this big global Anthropocene issues are going on, there are all of these socially induced problems that continue to also brutalize and devalue other groups of different groups of people. And so when we bring this together, the question becomes, how do we address all of these injustices simultaneously as we're thinking about transformation or even transformative policies in the Anthropocene? So as Caroline showed us, the 3 questions we were asked to answer, for me, I just want to speak to this first one right now, which is, are transformative policy future possible? Just like Frank said, yes, absolutely, they are possible. I believe a greener, a more sustainable, resilient, and equitable future is possible. but also, a techno-utopian future is possible, a dystopian growth-based future is possible. Literally multiple futures are possible, depending on the actions that we decide to take as humanities, depending on our policies, depending on our plans. All kinds of futures are possible. If we look into the past, we've seen a lot of transformation that did transform us socially, right? We can think about those significant societal shifts, especially, for instance, the abolition of slavery being one, women's suffrage being another, transformation globally and locally. And also civil rights movements in the US being another one, but also, the new vistas of knowledge, the internet age, the social media age, all of these are different kinds of transformations that has happened in the past. But as I think about, transformations now or that is needed, I'm thinking more about how do we envision a future where we literally live in harmony with one another, but also in harmony with nature, and while building an egalitarian future, not just for the current generation, but also laying that foundation for the future generation. And that's what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking we need a transformative policy futures, right? So thinking about just policies that is aimed at systemic change in current economic, cultural, political, and social structures, thinking about systemic changes in our operative logics, thinking about choosing people over profits, prioritizing ecosystems, health over corporate extraction, right? But also thinking about how do we transition towards that low carbon economy and lifestyle. And that's the big issue. How do we prioritize long-term gains over short-term interests? It's a big issue. And so we have these other two questions, which I will address as I move on. But I just wanted to lay that foundation that all kinds of future are possible depending on the actions we choose to take. And even when we choose to take, what we may deem collectively, as a future that can be positive, but we also must remember that, positive transformative futures are not going to be neutral or apolitical. It may benefit a lot of people, it also may grieve some others. So let's think about an example if we were to transition from fossil fuel, which I think is absolutely important, and we close all those coal mining, which is important, but then we open up lithium mining or cobalt mining, and that would also affect some communities. And so the question becomes, how do we really transition in a way that historically marginalized groups do not become caught in these so-called climate solutions where we're exchanging one problem for another? So that's something we need to be careful about. Even as we're pushing for transformation, we must make sure that we're bringing along people who have been historically marginalized by multiple types of injustices, quite frankly. And in a paper that I wrote in 2019, and in that paper, I was thinking about what we needed to do to transform our values as well. So we can talk about the material shift we want to see in society, the technological shift that needs to happen or that we need to abandon. We can think about all of those things. But I think fundamentally, when we're thinking about transformation, there are multiple spheres that needs to shift. One being our values as well. What do we value as a society? What do we value as humans? There needs to be a shift in political sphere, in social and cultural sphere, and in the consequences that we want to see. And so as I think about the shift in the value sphere, I'm thinking what needs to be transformed in our values, in our norms, just as Frank was talking about, that can move us in the right direction. So kind of laying that, I think we need a lot of research around normative shifts. There are some papers out there, but we certainly need more. But when it comes to the issue of who needs to be transformed, I'm not just thinking about individuals that needs to be transformed or just the values that individuals have or their visions, but I'm also thinking about our institutions, right? So the United Nations has been created almost 50 years ago. Is it really responding effectively to this 21st century problems? We have different national organizations, we have different international organizations. When you're thinking about migration, for instance, you can think about the IOM, UNHCR, all of these institutions. Are they responding effectively to the challenges we're facing right now? Or do we need institutional shifts? Or do we need new institutions to be able to respond to the global massive challenge we're facing in the Anthropocene? So when it comes to who needs to be transformed, those are multiple level. Individual but institutional transformations are important. But also, how will that shift occur, right? The shift in behavior, the shift in resource use, the shift in perceptions, how do we get there? We need more research to help us to understand how to move from point A to B, even if we know we needed to shift. And obviously, as we begin to think and change our institution, change ourselves, set an agenda for where we need to go, we also need to make sure that, the direction we're headed is actually visible. The results we want to see are things that we can evaluate and say, indeed, we're moving in the right direction. And I don't know if we are. I'm going to show you a few examples that really puts into question this idea that are we really shifting in the right direction? There's so many shifts happening right now, but are they moving on in the directions we want to be? So before I go in there, I just want to quickly talk about this issue about governance tools in the Anthropocene as well. We have a variety of governance tools, tons of them, but the typical ones being planning tools, right? So we plan our adaptation goals, we have climate mitigation plans, all sort of plans locally and globally, which is good. We need those visioning plans. And I think we certainly need more of them at multiple levels. We also use the regulatory tools or regulatory tools to kind of regulate what's going on in the environmental sectors, in the social sector. That's important. Tax and market-based tools, spending tools. We have all of those tools, and we often use them in response to whether programs or projects or creating new protocols. But the question is, as we're creating these tools or using these tools, are they really delivering the kinds of transformation we want to see? Are they helping us to set a pathway for the change that needs to happen in this century? Are they setting us towards the speed of change we need? Are they helping to move us towards the scale of outcome we need in terms of positive transformation that would allow us to live within the earth carrying capacity, but also allow us to live in an egalitarian and in a society that is also protective of ecosystems? So that's the question. And a quick example, especially when you think about a spending tool and the regulatory tools, or even if you like, the tax incentive. So think about the car-based solutions that people are proposing, moving from a gas-powered car society to an electric vehicle society, which, yeah, absolutely, it's important. But the question becomes, it's still about cars, right? Cars and vehicles still becomes the means of mobility. And in cities, we need to change. We don't need more cars, whether you're, having gas cars or electric cars, it's just cars and cars. When I'm thinking about transformation, I'm thinking more about what we need to change to create livable cities where we're not always dependent on cars, where we can find alternative mode of transportation, alternative, bicycling, walking, all kinds of ways where it's not just adding more cars to the existing number of cars. So those are things that I'm thinking about when we're looking at climate solutions. We need to be careful not to replace one problem with another. And also still on the issues of cars, for instance, the electric car, obviously they are powered by lithium and other forms of metal, especially rare earth materials as well. And where are these things being extracted from? So we need to think about who is paying for the price of carbon neutrality. And how do we address that? It's a big issue. I don't have the solutions to that issue, but I just wanted to remind us that there are people paying for what we may be celebrating today as carbon neutrality. We do need to go towards carbon neutrality. We need to move towards possibly electric vehicles, but how do we do it in a way that is just and fair and that we're not creating new problems for other societies? The all green energy transition, which many of us have embraced, is also very extractive. So how do we address those extractivist problem is a dilemma we haven't dealt with. And it's an issue that we need to talk about even in these larger conversations around transformations. And when we look at, the geographic locations of different countries and people in different countries, and also different continents as well, especially with the tech transition we're seeing, we know that a lot of this cost for tech transition is actually being borne by, a lot of countries in Africa. So the true cost of tech is borne by people who have historically been marginalized by colonialism, also been marginalized by globalization and capitalism, and now also been, affected by techno fixes. These are the injustices that we need to address. For those of you who are policymakers, who are political students and scholars, how do we address this issue? Because it will keep seeing a repeat of historical injustices happening, especially to people and to communities in Africa. If we move away from, just the car-based issue and think about another solution that many of us, again, have embraced, and I'm not saying this is wrong, I'm just saying we need to think about all of these issues in a holistic sense, especially a whole systems approach. As we begin to talk about shift from fossil fuel and moving to a solar panel being another example. A lot of researchers have been writing also that we need to think about the afterlives of a lot of these things, the afterlife of the lithium battery, the afterlives of, the wind turbines, where are they going to end up? Can we recycle them? The afterlives of the solar panels, and how much it's going to cost us to recycle these things. These are newer areas, I think, new vistas of research that we need students, we need scholars, we need social scientists to really get on board and help us to understand how we need to move this and shift in this transition in ways that the transformation, the larger transformation, will be equitable and will be just. And so to think about the knowledge and the governance shift, I'll be fast, I know my time is almost up. I think we need much more radical and visionary thinking as we move forward. We need to broaden the spaces of resistance, especially to extractivism and to corporate accumulation that is still continuing, whether in the context of fossil fuel or in the context of green transition. We're seeing still a lot of accumulation and extractivism, and that needs to stop, especially when you're thinking about climate justice for those who have been historically marginalized. We certainly need cultural shift and economic shift, thinking about which research are we funding. We have enough information, just like Frank said earlier, in the quantitative context, in the science. We know the climate change is time with tons of examples of what's going on. But the things that could really shift us are the social science knowledge, the psychological research, the governance research. And we need more of those, and we need to put a lot of funding into those types of research as well. We also need to find ways to mitigate misinformation and disinformation, even from billionaires like Elon Musk, denying climate change. And he has the platform to actually spread those disinformation. Those sort of things needs to end. And so those of us who are scholars working on these issues, we need to really create an army of people to help spread the right information and to mitigate this misinformation and disinformation about what's going on. And obviously advoicing techno fixes will be important, and overcoming, the political inertia where we're in right now will be key. And I just want to throw this out there. I promise I'm wrapping up very soon. Another thing which non-connected, well, in some ways connected to the environmental challenge, but there's a new challenge that I think we all need to think about, which is the issue of artificial intelligence. I know some of you are already thinking about this or writing about this, but I'm inviting a lot of political scholars as well and policymakers to help understand what we need to do. There are people who think we can use artificial intelligence for social good and maybe to address some of the environmental challenges, but there are people who say, it's going to lead to an Armageddon if we don't regulate it. And say, are we ready for the intelligence? This is something else, but we need to think about that as we think about transformation holistically. And just this is my last slide, just to say, for me, in terms of, the new knowledge and new approaches we need to move on to, and my other scholars or other panelists have already mentioned this, and these are 5 key points that I'm really pushing for, which is, we need to move beyond a growth-based economy. We need to embrace degrowth or some other kinds of growth system that doesn't allow us to continue to extract people, extract labor, extract land, and living beyond earth carrying capacity. We need to end those types of growth-based approaches and really think beyond that. We need to think of regenerative economies, regenerative agriculture, regenerative water systems. Everything that allows us to create a circular economy to live within our means, I think will be key going forward. The colonial approaches have already been mentioned by, two previous scholars. I wouldn't dwell on it, but I think a key one for me is this issue of care ethic. To be caring about the earth today or about other people, about institutions and the problems we are facing is actually a radical approach in this time and age, because everything that I've been told is to be self-centered, do what focus on individual goals. And so beyond, moving beyond all of those historical injustices and pushing for a care ethic globally and locally, I think is a radical thing to do. And I am pushing for that. And I'm hoping we can collectively, develop that sense of care for one another, but for the earth system as well. And obviously adaptive governance is always important as we move forward in thinking about what are the solutions we are putting together, and are the solutions yielding the kinds of results we want to see for this generation, but also for the future generations. So I will end there, but I want to thank everyone and excited to listen to the next speaker. Thank you all. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Jola. And I welcome Brian Head to the podium. We have about 45 minutes or so left. So hoping that we're going to go move straight to questions after Brian's remarks.
Well, Thank you indeed for the honour of joining this panel. It's dealing with some incredibly broad issues that are perhaps particularly useful for opening up a whole range of issues over the 3 or 4 days of a conference. I don't think anyone believes that we will solve the questions that are posed in the panel today. I'll also, I think, be somewhat briefer than the other speakers, partly because I don't want to repeat points that they have already made, but essentially because there's a lot of work that's been done on environmental and environmental justice type issues over a very long period of time. And it's possible that for some people, they're quite happy to talk about normative issues as the whole focus of their attention, and others, particularly from a more empirical public policy background, might be saying, well, actually, we've been doing a lot of work on this for decades. There's been a lot of governmental changes at international level, multilateral agreements, the heightened awareness of Indigenous knowledge, for example, has become much more important globally in recent times. And I'm also wanting to bounce off Frank Bierman's idea that environmental policy is too narrow. It's quite a shock for people who have been in that area for a while to find out that environmental policy is too narrow, and what we need to do is to be connecting up those issues to much broader matters of well-being for people and the environment more generally. So there's a lot of huge themes here. Let me just, so are transformative policy futures possible? This was a question that we were asked. Well, on a yes/no show of hands, of course. Everyone would say, well, of course, transformative social policy futures or policy futures are possible. But the real question in a public policy conference is always, we are not indifferent to the quality and focus of the policy changes that we're looking for. We are not just talking to among ourselves, you know, a very enlightened, well-intentioned group of people at an ICPP. The fact is that in this slide, I say basically half the world doesn't share this point of view. So what does that mean for the way we conduct our work? Do we press on regardless? Do we try and take measures to protect or insulate the good things that we're trying to do from the destructive and undermining behaviour of quite a few countries and corporations? So we're living in an era where we actually have to pay a lot of attention to which policy futures we want to encourage, and recognise that there's going to be a wide variety of techniques for having those conversations. There's not just one answer on this, obviously. And at the end of my talk, I'll basically say, you know, we need to have in effect, a pluralist or tolerant view that there needs to be or will be a whole bunch of different approaches that are worth pursuing. So I don't think the purpose of the panel is to come to an agreement about what's the approach we need to pursue and lock everyone in. It's more to say there's some massive transformations been happening. Frank Bierman's a book 10 years ago on Earth system governance is basically saying with the Anthropocene, things have changed. This is really serious, and the scale and interconnection of the issues is transformational. So we need to just kind of take stock of that and put that as in our big macro understanding of what's going on. So what knowledge and governance shifts are worthwhile? My view is we're actually already doing a lot. We've already learned a lot. I don't want to be a pessimist on this, albeit it's always less than people would like to see happen. And a lot of good proposals have fallen short for various reasons. But knowledge and governance shifts are already underway. There are a lot of, for example, research networks around this conference and around probably 100 other conferences every year. We are, trying to develop if you like, an evidence-based paradigm shift to bring together the best of research understanding and a sense of coherent and robust change that would be necessary to deal with the scale of the problems. So my students often say to me, surely there's a correct answer to this. Here's what we should be doing. And I say, well, actually, no, you might come up with what you think is a correct answer, and you might become an activist who is advocating for particular points of view. Having come to conferences like this for quite a while, I'm struck by the different tone from, let's say, going back 30, 40 years, that the tone these days is much more open to big picture ethical issues, big picture, just looking for my notes, big picture sort of concerns about social justice, environmental justice, all these sorts of things. I'm an optimist in the sense that I think there is an enormous amount of good work by many people in this room, but also hundreds of networks elsewhere that are contributing to two things. One, an understanding of what's going on. And that's always tough because there's so much happening at fast speed. And then secondly, in terms of trying to rethink our priorities, what is it that we actually wish to focus on? And can we then live with different approaches? My suggestion is that we do, in fact, need to be open-minded about what kinds of approaches are necessary. Good old-fashioned public policy says if you want to change the way the world works in a particular area, you put a lot of effort into looking at paradigm shifts, understanding the policy prioritization process, how you build support for new forms of understanding and initiatives. Excuse me, I'm sorry, that was bad. How can public policy in each country rise to the challenge in different ways? Because again, we're not in the business of generalization here. So a lot of the networks will have international links, and there's a lot of learning from each other, but I think there's a lot of specificity required to show how social, economic, well-being, other sorts of objectives can fit together in a medium-term way to inform research agendas. That's my first point for the public policy conference here. We absolutely have to spend time thinking through the implications of these big picture issues for the way we do our prioritization of research. So what are the new ways of thinking creatively? Well, if we did a poll of everyone in this room, you would all have a bunch of quite different ideas, and that's fine. I think that there's a lot of younger people, for example, who are into design thinking, who are into policy labs, who are interested in small group dynamics to generate ideas, which is a long way away from governmental implementation. So it's more at the front end of the process. Given the mess we're in, and given the need to do things a lot better, where do new ideas come from that have some possibility of being effective and being supported by a sufficient number of stakeholders and so forth? There's also the dangers of not falling for magical bullets, like Frank made a strong point, which I was anticipating, that we don't want to put a geoengineering shield around the earth to solve all the problems, and that dissolves our obligation to stop polluting the atmosphere. So there's a whole lot of issues going on there. There's been quite a lot of support for taking the Sustainable Development Goals seriously. A number of panelists have mentioned that. The inspirational value, the value capital of the SDGs is quite powerful, and to the extent that we can leverage that kind of goodwill, might make a difference in some quarters, but perhaps not in others. Building support is really fundamental to political science and public policy studies. So how do we develop evidence-informed ideas that incorporate best available thinking and evidence as a basis for then thinking about policy strategies, policy options, and so on and so forth? And we're also very aware from the other panelists' comments and from more broadly that most solutions are not without downside as well. Like if you say, well, we're going to do something big next year, and that will solve the problem, beware what you wish for, because a lot of short-sighted policies have been introduced over the last 20 years where the knowledge about material science, the knowledge about whole of life cycle responsibility, those sorts of things, things such as the slide that you saw before about what happens with obsolete solar panels. We're generating a whole bunch of other related issues around the back door, and we've got to have a holistic point of view about how we're tackling it. So in conclusion, there's a nice picture where we hopefully can choose the green bit on the left. Not every academic is going to be an advocate or an activist, but I think, sorry, I think that we used to have these debates years ago where people would say, research needs to be informed by values and you need to be explicit about your values, but you shouldn't derive your conclusions just from your values. And that's still a very lively area of debate. It comes up in 100 different ways. we need to allow for a range of contributions. I think that's sort of where I'm coming from, and that this will reflect, various generations, for example, young people and older people, people from global north and south, people who have, like me, had government experience or worked in the not-for-profit sector, making sure that we bring forward those sorts of practitioner forms of knowledge to help inform, shape, moderate the sort of proposals that we eventually come up with. My last phrase is basically let 1,000 flowers bloom as we work towards greater sustainability. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to all the panelists who've given us a lot of elements of transformation to think about. The floor is open for questions. So we have microphones on the floor in every section, and they will come to you when they see your hand. Philippe is telling me that we have to, you can tell. Yeah. You.
Okay. So you can ask question directly, or you can ask question through the app if you don't want to take the microphone. For this, you go to the app. There is a button called plenary session, sorry. You choose our session and you have a button for question. All the question will be arrive here and come back to the plenary. Thank you.
Thank you. So Mia, who's a PhD student in our policy studies program, she's collecting all the online questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 3 questions and then I'm going to turn to the panelists to address the questions as they will. And then I will go to Mia and take some online questions and back to the room. Okay, so we've got some hands over here on the left side of the room. If the microphones can migrate over there, and I'll take the 3 questions. And if you don't mind introducing yourself, that'd be nice too.
Okay, my name is Mareike Blum. I work at the Mercator Research Institute in Berlin, and as well for Policy Advice Council for the German government. Thank you all for these inspiring talks. I think they were very timely, and I have a question for Frank. I very much agree that we need this urgency governance and all the points that you raised. My question is about the planetary justice point that you mentioned. And there is this new paper by Rockström et al. And Joeita Gupta. And you also mentioned the risk of reductionists, like putting a number on justice. Like, what's your take on this? Because on the one hand, I think they have these 3 dimensions that can stimulate the debate, but then they kind of put it into a number. So that I would be interested what you think about this. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that question. There's behind you as well.
Thanks. I'm Jana Baum from the Center for Advanced Internet Studies in Bochum. And I have a more general question, more to the first 3 presentations. You all talked about some kind of transformation in a specific field based on the premise that a transformation is possible. And in philosophy, there's a debate about how transformation is possible. For example, in Hegelian philosophy, also followed by Hannah Arendt, Michel Foucault, Judith Butler, and they all state something more or less like a necessary condition for transformation is a state of openness prior to the transformation. State of openness understood on one hand on a society level, that we need dynamic power structures for change. On the other hand, also on an individual level, that we need an open mind or something like that to introduce a change. So my question is, how would you assess the state of openness in your specific field or more exciting, I think the question, where would you identify a lack of openness in your field, which in my argumentation has to be addressed first and has to be opened in order to have a transformation? Thank you.
Great, thank you for your question. And we have a question here in the front right.
Inga Olmetsane. I'm from De Montfort University in Leicester, UK. And I have a question how to deal with politics of sustainable development goals, because several people mentioned them. Sustainable development goals include important things like quality education, gender equality, and so on. But also many things are absent from sustainable development goals. For example, democracy, freedom, human rights. And that goes right in the heart of politics of SDGs, because they are accepted by all United Nations member states. And that includes a lot of authoritarian countries. That includes countries such as Russia, Belarus, Iran, and others, where leaders do not have this democratic mandate from free elections. And so it is important to take these SDGs seriously, but it's also important to take them politically and critically. And how do you think to deal with that?
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for the questions. So I'm going to go to you, Frank, if you're there and can hear us, for the first question on planetary justice.
Good, thank you. This was a question about planetary justice, also related to this new paper. That's of course difficult to discuss a paper that most of you will not have seen. The core idea is, I mean, most people have heard about the planetary boundaries, an approach originally from the natural sciences to define 9 boundaries of our planet, such as climate change, ozone layer, biodiversity, and others, and to quantify those boundaries. And now a new paper has been published by a group of scholars who describe themselves as an Earth Commission, kind of self-appointed in a certain way. I mean, many of them are very good friends of mine, so I have to be very careful of discussing it. And their approach is to bring in justice in quantified words. I mean, they kind of quantify justice considerations at a planetary level. And I have, I mean, to be frank, I have doubts whether this is the right approach. Not necessarily because, I mean, I absolutely believe that the justice is important. I just do not believe that scientists and small groups of scientists, professors, that they should define and decide on the justice qualifications and what justice actually means at the planetary scale. So I think this is a typical case where I believe the scientists should engage in discourse on justice, but reframe and not engage in giving a number themselves on what justice actually is. I think this needs to be left to a global conversation in which all sorts of stakeholders and communities are involved. This should not be set by a group of 10 or 20 scientists. They don't have the mandate to decide quantitatively on justice implications. And I think if you read this paper, there's also many doubts in this paper. So thank you, Marieke Blum. I am critical of this particular paper. I have things to say with the other points also, but I leave it to my colleagues.
Great, thank you. I'll open the second question to any of the panelists. The question is about, based on the assumption that transformation is possible, can you comment on the state of openness that is required prior to transformation and where we are at with that? Any of the panelists want to address that?
I can, and I imagine other panelists will be able to add their thoughts as well. When she said state of openness, I think I was wondering what the speaker meant, whether she meant openness in an academic field or openness in the society. And I think, you know, I'm historically, well, I'm a geographer. So geographers, we are open generally to all kinds of research. So in my academic field, if it's about academic field, there is certainly an openness to shift and changes. But if we're thinking about society as, you know, is the society ready, and what do society needs to be ready for transformation? I think one can think about it on multiple levels, right? One is that there are instances where transformation can be forced, where you have grassroots movement come together, you have, justice activists come together, you advocates, all sort of people may come together to actually force transformation to happen. Or sometimes you may have a chaos. You may have an inflation, you may have a recession that could leave open opportunity for new shifts and turns in society. And so there are different ways for those who have been studying transformation over time. There are different things that can actually push transformation. It can be deliberate, it can be planned, it can be pushed. And so in terms of openness, it's not just about one individual or one set of people pushing society. There might be multiple levers of pushes that could allow for transformation, and there could be a chaos that could open up the system for that transformation. So I have a paper that I discussed this a little bit, so I'll leave it in the chat. Maybe people can check that out. But I did talk about in that paper the different kind of shifts and turns that could happen, especially at the urban level, to lead to that could open up spaces for transformation.
Great, thank you. Do either of any of the other panelists want to comment on the openness, the state of openness? Yeah, Deb.
Is it on? Okay, good. Thank you. I like the question, learned a little bit more about philosophy. I guess the way I look at what I guess see, let's say even in a Canadian context, is it seems to me that crisis, unfortunately, seems to be an impetus for transformation. So I guess in some ways it's the endpoint. What kind of transformation is it? Is it a desirable one or one that maybe we didn't want to see? Because I'm pretty sure everyone can think about how something that's confronting people like climate crisis or other biodiversity crisis can make people more divisive as well. Like I think we see that as well. Like it's so part of, I like the idea of precondition. I think there's probably other ones other than an openness, but I do think what I do see is people having conversations that they never had before. So I think there's an openness to just say climate change isn't just carbon, it's the other C words. It's also equity. It's also, to me, I also think about it as, again, people's readiness to let it go, to let some things go. So this was in the presentation after me. Sorry, I can't quite see her name, where she had the electric cars. I remember being in a workshop and people just said, electric cars is a solution. I go, I think the idea is that we shouldn't want a car. Like it was totally like, is to not want. Like, how do you not want, right? Like, how do you let go of things that we just take for, that we don't question that we should have? So that relates to the sustainable development. I mean, to some extent, I mean, not all Indigenous people share this, but I remember being in another workshop where this life that we take for granted, we have to kind of let that go. Like it's not sustainable. So what are we willing to kind of let go? So maybe that's kind of where I saw the openness coming. Like, are people open to that? But then also, are people actually ready for that? So there's like kind of two elements to that. And then how do you assess the state of that? I don't have the skills to do that. It's just mostly kind of observational, like where you just go, yay, but then you see an undercurrent of resistance to, I don't know what I would consider to be innovative solutions. So sometimes these can create binaries or reactions that were actually undesirable. But I like that. But I like that question. I would prefer that people, you know, were ready for transformation based on an openness and creativity and imagination than crisis. Because that makes people more closed off than more open. So I appreciate the question, and I'll have to think about that a little bit more in terms of what I see and observe. So thank you.
Great. And then the third question was about the Sustainable Development Goals, that there are many things absent, what is required, how can we think about them more politically and more critically? And how much faith do we have that the Sustainable Development Goals are guiding policy attention, policy action? Anybody want to tackle that one?
Frank?
right?
I could take this on briefly because this has been the core area of my research of the last couple of years. And I mean, it's absolutely right. The SDGs are the broadest goals we ever had at the global level, much bigger than the Millennium Development Goals or any other goals. And on the other hand, they do not cover a lot of things. I mean, democracy, freedom, human rights has been mentioned. And also, they're internally inconsistent. I mean, there is a goal that speaks about economic growth. On the other hand, there's a goal that speaks about climate protection. So there are goals that are not necessarily internally consistent. They are the result, the outcome of a governmental process that brought in also parts of civil society. But the point is also, and this is what our research has shown, I brought it in this one slide, they didn't have any effects actually, or not really seriously effect. We looked at effects in the international system in different countries, including Australia actually, and many other places, and we couldn't find substantial changes that the SDGs have actually brought in governmental policies and local governance, and also not in industry or in any other societal domain. So therefore, this huge agenda from 2015 in which the United Nations and governments have agreed that they would change the world. I mean, this is what this agenda actually says on the website. They say this is about transforming our world. This has just not happened. And the question, and this is a question that we are now analyzing, is also what else have they maybe done? And there are maybe also negative points. They have maybe stabilized current conservative structures in our societies because everybody believes the world becomes better because we have the SDGs. And this is just an illusion. So the next paper that we'll write is about the politics of illusions. I mean, how can governments and other actors stabilize conservative politics and block change by presenting them as being in compliance with the SDGs. So I'm quite critical of the SDGs, and I'm looking for new ways and different ways of how we can have more progressive and more transformative global governance. And one example, just in closing, that also this electric car example was fantastic. It's a typical way where this is a false solution for many places. So I believe in my strategy of having bans all over the place. We should just ban electric cars also over time. And Amsterdam is pretty close to it. I mean, Amsterdam is at some point is very much working into the direction where I live of not having any cars in the inner city anymore and rebuilding the city tremendously, totally, by prioritizing pedestrians and prioritizing bicycles and prioritizing public transportation, because this is what the future needs to be. And electric cars are not a solution for most places, maybe for certain areas, of course, but not for inner cities. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go to Mia, see if we can have a few questions that have been submitted online. She will need a microphone. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'll summarize one of the questions because there was a few questions that had a similar theme. And it was this question of the gap of knowledge and representation from the global south and recognizing the systems of power in place that contribute to that disparity. What can universities do, researchers do, governments, NGOs, PhD students, to support, or in the global north, to support the global south in increasing the discourse. Another question, and this is specifically for Deborah, was how can, governments or NGOs support Indigenous people in developing and implementing their own practices? And also, how can we do that in a way that is not further colonizing the knowledge that is being generated and shared? And then a further question sort of along those lines as well was the siloing of knowledge and social justice movements, and the way or proposing, or I guess a question to the panel about a way to decrease that siloing. So, not just Indigenous governments and justice and environmentalism separate, but a world where there's more inclusion and then possibly that, contributes.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to open the question about the gap of knowledge related to the global south and what can researchers do to enable discourse and research and transformation.
Mm.
Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Okay, so they're very big questions. And again, my point about not generalizing, each institution will have a different way of thinking about this and different investment capacities and different flexibilities about building new teams to deal with really interesting and powerful new developments. I think this is a recurrent set of issues that comes up every now and then. When the early days of environmentalism and social movements were sweeping this country and elsewhere, a lot of these debates were very hot, and people were trying to say, how can we get the new thinking into the way we make decisions, the way we make investment priorities, the way we talk with our students about what counts as a good, worthwhile topic for you to do if you are doing, for example, a master's or a PhD project. And I think we've come full circle in that, and I expect that we'll come back around on a pretty regular basis. So I don't think there's anything particularly novel in that set of questions. It's very, very important that each institution will already have thought through that in some detail. Some have been very lucky to be able to tap into external funding of one kind or another to set up, for example, some kind of Anthropocene research center or various other kinds of nomenclature, and over a period of time developing a reputation for excellence. I'm looking partly at Frank on this one because I think the Utrecht group is quite outstanding from that point of view. On the other hand, there are huge debates inside many institutions about whether they wish to be, sorry, whether they wish to be seen as identified with a particular point of view on environmental and ecological policy settings. There are sensitivities at faculty level and university level about not identifying too much with a particular point of view. That can be something that can get very tricky. And I know some of you have been through that one way or another. So I think it's a normal set of concerns. I think that having some opportunities like at a conference like this to be able to talk with colleagues about, well, what are you doing? Is there a prospect of a new set of principles and issues that can guide a collective forward agenda? I think that's really important and obvious and something that will happen anyway. I think there's, again, no single best solution here. I think in my own institution, we've tried several different versions of this, none of which are particularly impressive. And don't quote me on that, but I think there's a lot to be said for exploring more rigorously various sorts of strategic approaches to research agendas for the future.
Great, thank you. I'll turn to Deborah for the question about how can policy processes, governments integrate traditional knowledge, peoples, and do that without further colonizing approaches.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. I think there's a whole bunch of ways to think about that. I think there's different ways of looking at it. I guess I'm not crazy about the integration approach because basically it means assimilation a lot of the times. So So as I mentioned before, it's sort of recognizing Indigenous peoples as societies and rights holders, nations, and now self-government agreements, self-governing, can make laws. So working with Indigenous peoples, communities, or nations like you would provinces, like a government. So that's a different way than we just want your knowledge and let's develop some ethical methods for extracting it from you and then we'll stick it in this thing and then ignore you after that. That tends to be how it happens. That's another rant. But but what I found in what I call the climate change circles that I find myself in is there, like a lot of it is attitude change, similar to the openness question is, so there's still very much an attitude of Indigenous peoples are a problem to be solved. So it's sort of, it's a very kind of negative, kind of deficit sort of approach to Indigenous peoples and the challenges that they face, as opposed to, I'm like, okay, we had to deal with transformation. We had to deal with major crisis in our lives. We had to, and we used our own knowledge to do it. It wasn't other people's solutions. They were generated from us to be able to survive, to be here and say, I'm part of the Anishinaabe Nation, when there was a policy to say that wasn't going to be so 100 years after Confederation. So I find that that's a huge problem. It started to shift internationally, I think, with the Brundtland report, a little bit just saying, hey, maybe these people have something to contribute to solutions, as opposed to always being the problem we got to solve. So that's still really prevalent. And in a lot of the spaces I find myself in. So the other is what I call related to it is, I just call it the development perspective, which I was hoping we were kind of past that in terms of these conversations, which is, again, a lot of these spaces I'm in, where if only we could go up north and get people to just buy into our ideas of how to do sustainable infrastructure, everything would be cool for them. And I'm going, really? Like, you still have that kind of idea? Like, you're from the South and you didn't get it after 40 years of doing stuff, supposedly working with people, but they weren't, because they were more trying to like impose more like the Southern agenda on the North. I remember being quite disturbed with that. I couldn't name it at first, but there's still very much that perspective still exists. If only we could get people to buy into the silos of climate change, even though that's not how people experience it, as opposed to the other way around. So I think, so there's these kind of attitudes, these underlying attitudes that keep interfering, I think, with, it sounds like a gross word, but it's the one I can think of on the spot, more enlightened kind of conversations and decision-making, and what collaborations can kind of look like. Even as before, like the broader climate science, I guess, policy framework in Canada, the Climate Science 250, they don't really quite know what Indigenous led looks like. Like, again, like we're in the boxes. The boxes are all stuff that people were doing 20 years ago, which is definitely not Indigenous led. Like, those are the examples that are being highlighted. And I was like super disappointed. So I think there needs to be, so that kind of relationship needs to shift in these kind of attitudes, which are very difficult to change. I think the other thing that I would say about it is just reflecting on some of the work of Kyle White, who looks at sort of these global kind of relationships from a climate change and Anthropocene, other kind of level. And he says, really what we have is a crisis in relationships. We don't have great relationships. If you don't bother with the relationships and try to establish them in some sort of equitable, respectful kind of way, then we're perpetuating this development perspective, this deficit model of looking at, thinking about how to work with Indigenous peoples as opposed to more strength-based. Having said that, there is a tension that I also experienced, because that colonialism and capitalism and other kind of processes, Indigenous peoples are vulnerable and experience these in very distinct, these changes and impacts in very distinct kind of ways. So people have to be very knowledgeable. And I think there needs to, I think we're getting there in terms of attitude shift, but that attitude is still very much there, despite very well-intentioned kind of people. The other thing that I would say is, I don't, in some of these circles, they just really upset when I say this. I don't think we need to ask different questions. I think other panelists kind of pointed to this. We don't always ask the right questions. So when I'm in the room full of suit scientists, they get really mad when I say, you didn't ask the right questions 4 or 5 decades ago. That's why we don't have that body of knowledge right now. And some of it is the knowledge gaps of working with people in the global South. If we don't ask the right questions, don't have the right people there, and don't have that knowledge, then we're just going to keep thinking of these solutions that really aren't like solving the problem, as every disaster report kind of points to. So I think we need to be way more imaginative and innovative and creative about the kind of inquiry that we have and who should be involved in that, what that looks like. And other panelists have spoken to this. We have to pop out of that siloed, I'm a very interdisciplinary scholar being in environmental studies, and I spend a lot of my career being disciplined into the discipline. But we need to pop out of that in order to be creative enough in terms of our preconditions and our attitudes in terms of meeting the challenges that we're facing. Anyway, that was kind of long-winded, but a good question. Thank you
Yeah,
for
and
that.
a good transition to the next one, because in addition to interdisciplinary, the question was about decreasing silos, which we, required for transformation, which is a classic public policy and public administration question. It was framed in the way of decreasing silos between different approaches that were tabled today, but also between policy fields. I mean, we still think and construct our research agendas in these silos, or whatever you want to call them, policy areas, policy domains. But maybe the panelists have any thoughts on how the transformations that are required related to the state of the planet may move us in the direction of decreasing silos.
If
Anybody?
I may, yeah, I'll just add a few of my thoughts because I do have to run in 5 minutes. First, I'm going to come back to, I think these are all great questions. I'm going to come back to the decreasing silo thing, but I did want to add to the initial comments about, how do we ensure that researchers in the global south are also funded and supported. I think there are examples. For example, in my case, I am a Canadian and I did study in Canada at Western University. And I was able to get this funding from IDRC to do my doctoral field research in Nigeria. And so there are examples of those types of funding that could be increased to, build capacity for people doing doctoral or master's program abroad. I think SHEC also funds postdoctoral research. So I really want to commend Canada for those types of initiative. And I think there are some others in Europe as well, and as well as in America. But I think those sort of funding needs to increase to support researchers in the global south. So that's something I wanted to emphasize. And the second thing, to go back to this breaking down of silos, I think that it can happen in multiple forms, one of which includes, the silos in which we have the educational system, the way it's been developed, right? So I do work with climate scientists, and we had this research on cascading disasters. So there are some of us who are social scientists, and there are, the natural scientists working with us. And then there's often this tension about, where do you publish your paper? And we wrote this paper, and I wrote the policy implications of the findings of cascading disasters. And I asked my natural scientists, the climate science, like, okay, let's get into the climate science literature. And he said, they're not going to take this paper. It has too many policy elements. So I was really frustrated by that, because I was hoping that the climate scientist world and journals are now open to the policy implications of a lot of the climate challenges we're facing. And so there is a need to break down silos in our different respective disciplines, but also in the journals, the outlets in which we're communicating this findings of our research. We need to find ways to integrate different forms of knowledges so that we can reach multiple people and not just a particular group. So that's another area. I think another one is also the issue that's been mentioned earlier by Frank and maybe others, the funding. We need to fund all types of research, not really give the millions to only nature and natural science types of funding or types of research. We need to also fund the social science research, the policy research, the political science studies, the psychological studies. So those are some of the 3 key areas that I think the shifts needs to happen, but societally as well, we can think about shift happening locally in terms of building broader base for climate justice movements, funding those movements, funding community-based research that is not just academics coming in and jetting in for people to do research, really giving funding or grants to different local institutions and grassroots-based organizations to do their own sort of analysis of what's going on and be able to work with researchers to communicate their finding to the world. So there are all kinds of ways I think we can begin to break the silos, and these are areas that I think we can be further much more visionary and imaginative, but it's happening. But I think the scale is not enough. We need it to happen at a grand scale And hopefully we'll see more of those in the near future, but certainly it's happening already, but it's not enough.
Great, thank you. So we're out of time, and I'm just going to hope that this panel provided some good food for thought for about how your own research, your own scholarship, and as Frank said, your own scholarly activism relates to these pressing planetary and realities. So I'd like to thank Frank, Deborah, Jola, and Brian for taking time to share their thoughts on policy transformations related to the age of the Anthropocene. And I wish you all a good conference, and we'll see you in some of the social settings today and later on. Have a good day.
Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
I'm good.
Nice to see you. Nice to see you. Nice to see you. It has been a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for coming to the plenary.
Yeah. Deborah is here, so I'm supposed to have lunch with her.
Deborah Van Nuys.
Yes.
Yeah, she's right there.
Okay.
In the white jacket with the
Okay.
stripes.
Perfect. Let me.
We'll see you later.
Bye, Caroline.
Bye-bye.